Okay, I'm going to get started. I'm talking to an empty room, which is a little weird, but you can view this online and it'll be about the same difference. Last time we were talking about the problems, genetic problems that can potentially cause intellectual disabilities or intellectual deficits. We talked about PKU last time. For the longest time, PKU was the number one cause of mental retardation for babies. Then we started testing all the children for phenylketonuria, and once we did that, the number of individuals suffering from PKU went down markedly. If somebody does have PKU or they don't have the ability to metabolize phenylketonuria, we can put them on a special diet, and it will take care of that problem. One of the interesting things is that if you look at your soda cans, your pop cans, especially if you're drinking diet drinks, it'll say phenylketonurics contains phenylalanine, which means if you are an individual on that special diet, then you cannot consume that type of soda because it has phenylalanine in it, and your body can't metabolize, can't take care of the waste product of phenylalanine. Now that we've done away with PKU, with the problem of PKU, the number one cause of intellectual disability is Fragile X syndrome. As you can see from these genes, it looks like there's extra material on one of the X chromosomes. This is a little girl, by the way. It looks like there's extra material on one of the X chromosomes, and the reality is there is extra material on the X chromosome. It looks like a piece of it is about to break off, but the reality is it just has extra genetic material. What has happened is that it has an excessively repeated trinucleotide that is in an abundance of 4 times normal, causing the extended appearance of the chromosome. So it's because of the trinucleotide that you have this material, this extra genetic material. Now the bizarre part is that if that actually breaks off, the degree of intellectual disability that takes place is actually quite high, as strange as that may seem. Now the odd thing about individuals suffering from Fragile X is they all look alike. We saw Williams syndrome where everyone has a similar facial structure. As far as Fragile X is concerned, we see exactly the same thing. These individuals tend to have a broad forehead, elongated faces, large prominent ears. They tend to be cross-eyed or have strabismus. Highly arched palate, so it goes far up into the mouth, whereas and so they have difficulty talking because of that. Because they normally we use our tongue against our palate in order to speak. They have hyperextendable joints. They do have hyperextendable joints, but the joints are also not fragile isn't the correct word, but they come out of socket. Their joints will come apart from time to time. And this is fairly common. They rub their hands a lot, so this is known as self-abuse, and so they will develop hand calluses. They have an indented chest. It's a caved-in chest, and this is known as pectus excavatum, where they have an indented chest. Mitral valve prolapse, and because of the mitral valve prolapse, they tend to have heart problems. If it's a male, they have enlarged testicles. Hypotonia, they have low muscle tone, soft fleshy skin, flat feet, and they tend to have seizures, but that only occurs in about 10% of the individuals. Hello, I've got somebody to talk to. Thank you so much for being here. I was talking to no one there for a moment, and it was a little embarrassing. About 40% of children born to alcoholic mothers show a distinctive profile of anatomical, physiological, and behavioral impairments known as fetal alcohol syndrome. These are full-term babies. Both of these individuals were full-term babies. As you can see, the normal baby has a much more complex brain. It's a much larger brain. They have more sulci, as you can see. This is not nearly as complex as the normal baby's brain. So drinking alcohol during pregnancy, not the best idea in the world. As a matter of fact, it's a pretty bad idea as far as the baby is concerned. Children suffering from fetal alcohol syndrome show stunted growth and select facial abnormalities. They have a small brain, as we saw before. They also have a small corpus callosum, and we're going to see the difference between a normal baby's brain and a child suffering from fetal alcohol syndrome. They have small eye sockets, a flat mid-face, indistinct philtrum. That's this thing right here. This thing. Actually, your face is formed in two halves and then it comes together. And that's one of the reasons why if somebody has a cleft palate, it's because it didn't come together correctly. So oddly enough, and this has something to do with symmetry, the two halves of the face are formed separately and they come together. And because of that, we have a philtrum. There's a thing that ties your lip to the inside of your head, and you can feel that, and that is one of the last things that forms. And if that doesn't form, of course, your lip has no control. You have less control over your lip. And of course, these are things that happen to these individuals. So they have an indistinct philtrum, they have a thin upper lip. The distance between their lip and their nose is much wider, or much longer than it is with other individuals. They have a small chin, a short nose, lowered ears. They tend to be down closer to the jawline. They have a low nasal bridge and epicanthic folds in their eyelids. Epicanthic folds have to do with a fat pad underneath their eyes. The Chinese or Asians tend to have a epicanthic fold. Much to my surprise, both of my sisters have epicanthic folds. What does that mean? Not a whole lot. I mean, it actually, people that don't normally have or wouldn't, it's not part of their genetic makeup, they can have epicanthic folds. Both of my sisters have them. And we have no ancestry except English, Irish, German, Belgian, and French. That's the only ancestry we have. So where in the world did they get their epicanthic folds? Well, evidently this is not uncommon in most populations. But the epicanthic folds is what, they say the Chinese and the Japanese have slanted eyes. It's actually the epicanthic folds. And sometimes they're fairly extensive. But these individuals have epicanthic folds as well, as do children with Down syndrome. Brain impairment is due to their small brain and brain structure problems like the almost absent corpus callosum. This is a corpus callosum. As you can see, it's a fairly distinct area. This is a normal brain. You can see how involved, how complex this brain is. This is a baby with fetal alcohol syndrome. As you can see, the forehead is slanted more, and you can't even see the corpus callosum. I mean, it's gone. Well, there's two spots, one right here and one right here. But as you can see, this is far more extensive. You can see how simple this brain is as compared to this very complex brain. So the probability of this individual having an intellectual deficit is very high, is extremely high, as a matter of fact, since there's not very much surface to that baby's brain. Intellectual disability can be mild to severe, possibly depending on the time during pregnancy and the level of consumption. As I said last time, it isn't the volume of the alcohol you drink, it's the volume of alcohol that you drink at one time. So binge drinkers tend to have babies that have worse fetal alcohol syndrome than babies that the mother shouldn't drink at all. Or a mother that drinks constantly. If she drinks constantly, of course, if she stays drunk through the entire pregnancy, the probability of the baby being normal is fairly remote. But we know that it doesn't take all that much alcohol to cause a problem. So we do have fetal alcohol syndrome. Now, sadly enough, of course, this has been around forever. Fetal alcohol syndrome has been around since there has been alcohol. But they didn't discover the whole syndrome until the 1980s. And unfortunately, they found it on the Pine Ridge Reservation. Yeah, I know. It's kind of bizarre. So, anyway. Okay. They also saw it in Germany a lot, and these are all pictures from Germany, or these are pictures of children from Germany. Besides intellectual disability, children with FAS also show such neurological abnormalities as hyperactivity, irritability, and tremulousness, and we see this a lot. This sounds like ADHD, doesn't it? So the possibility is that if you have a child suffering from ADHD, there's a possibility the mother drank during her pregnancy. Fetal alcohol syndrome is one thing, but we also have what they refer to as fetal alcohol effect, where the problem isn't as obvious, but there is still some degree of disability that has been caused by the drinking of the mother. And of course that includes hyperactivity and irritability. So if you've got a child that, I'm not saying if you have a child, if you're teaching and there's a child in your class that has a problem, then potentially it's because the mother drank during pregnancy. We see the same things in marijuana consumption, especially the hyperactivity and irritability. We see these two as well. I was looking at this last night. I got curious, and as I was going over my lecture today, I decided that I would look it up to see what the new research is saying. And the new research is saying exactly the same things. The old research, the fact that, of course, we haven't really done a lot of studies with marijuana and problems with pregnancy, but there are very few sites, very few legitimate sites anyway, that are saying that smoking marijuana during pregnancies is a good idea. I had a student who had a girlfriend that was pregnant, and he was a heavy marijuana user, and he was in favor of legalizing marijuana, and he wanted everybody to smoke pot, you know the whole game, and he decided that he would allow his wife, or his girlfriend, they weren't married, he would allow her or he would suggest that she smoke marijuana. And the reason he wanted her to smoke marijuana was because she had morning sickness. And of course that takes away nausea. So because of that, and I kept telling him, if you look at all these studies, none of them say that marijuana is benign. It doesn't say that there's a reason or an excuse for smoking marijuana during pregnancy. All you're doing is endangering your child. And of course, I couldn't convince him because he had already decided that there was nothing wrong with marijuana. Anyway.
What happened to the child?
I'm sorry?
The child?
I don't know. The baby was born after they closed our school. They closed our campus, and the baby was born afterwards. So I have no idea what happened with the baby. And of course, you really can't tell right away. Probably, potentially, the baby cries too much. Well, lots of babies cry, but I had no idea what happened with it. But the research seems to be saying that it's not a good idea. That it's very similar to fetal alcohol syndrome. Autism, and actually the number of people with autism has greatly increased. And one of the reasons is because we've changed the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. Before we had two conditions. One of them was autism and the other was Asperger's syndrome. And now we've taken both of those groups and we've stuck them together and we call it autism spectrum disorder. Autism spectrum disorder is a lifelong developmental disorder that is characterized by slight to severe social impairment and language. About 70% of the individuals suffering from autism spectrum disorder develop poor language skills, rarely getting beyond monosyllabic responses and echolalia. In other words, they just repeat what you say, or they can only say one or two things. People with autism or autistic spectrum disorder, even Asperger's syndrome, the problem is they don't look people in the face. So because they don't look people in the face, they don't see how people are pronouncing things. They don't recognize people. And of course, this is a spectrum, so there are individuals you can't even tell there is a problem to individuals that won't pay any attention to anybody. And of course, those individuals rarely learn how to speak, but the other individuals become college professors. You think I'm kidding? One of the great things about autism spectrum disorder, it allows you to, or doctors, they become medical doctors. It allows you to concentrate, to focus on something. I had a friend with Asperger's syndrome, and he could sit in the middle of a party with all kinds of things going on around him. People screaming and drinking beer and splashing, and maybe somebody's making out in the corner. And this guy could read a textbook and concentrate on that textbook because his focus he was myopic. He could only think of one thing at a time, which was interesting because when he talked to you, he focused on you, and the world could be exploding around you and he wouldn't see that at all. It was just very, very bizarre. Anyway, and he's a college professor, an English professor. He's not very good. He's very attractive, and not to me, of course. I think he was our miler. But when he lectures, he doesn't talk to his class. He lectures from his notes. Because remember, he can only do one thing at a time. It's kind of like a robot. He can only do one thing at a time. So he can't look at his class and talk to them because he doesn't remember what he's going to say. So he reads and he speaks in a monotone almost all the time. But because he's an attractive man, people like him. We like attractive people. We don't like unattractive people. So unfortunately, that's the way it works. Anyway, okay, so autism spectrum disorder doesn't have to correspond with any mental deficiency, but the lack of social interaction may impair the diagnosis. And this is part of the problem, is the fact that you can't get them to pay attention to anybody else. I've got a functional MRI in just a second where you're going to see, well, let me show you. Well, here it is right here. Normally, when an individual meets a stranger, they scan their faces for recognition and potentially put this information into their long-term memory so that they can remember them later. However, individuals with autism show brain scans where they seek no recognition and therefore have a difficult time making new acquaintances. This is how a person with autism reacts to a stranger. As you can see, nothing's lighting up at all. This is how they react to somebody that they know. So if you, I closed this door because there was nobody in here and it felt kind of weird. Okay. But as you can see, this is how they are reacting to individuals that they know. It's bizarre. If you've ever been around somebody with autism, the individual won't pay any attention to you whatsoever. But if somebody comes in the room that they know, they will interact with that individual. You can't talk to them. You certainly can't touch them because their whole world is right here, is in their minds. And if you touch them, that's like somebody trying to invade their space, and they can't handle that. They just can't handle that, and it really freaks them out, as it were. Their whole world is routine. Everything is a routine. And they have to do the same thing over and over and over again. If you've ever seen the movie Rain Man, no, that's not important. If you've ever, Rain Man had a set schedule. Every day he had to do exactly the same thing. And he had to use toothpicks to pick up his Cheetos. He used a toothpick to pick up Cheetos. And if he didn't have his toothpicks, he got out of his routine and he couldn't function. And he would just go crazy. Loud noises, anything that's different, he couldn't handle it. He just couldn't handle it because it was outside his routine. So everything had to be the same thing over and over and over again. And that's the way autism spectrum disorder. This is the more severe cases of autism spectrum disorder. Individuals that have Asperger's syndrome, of course, they can handle all of these things because their organization is different. They have normal organization in their brains. Autism spectrum disorder seems to have something to do with brain organization. Particularly, all information is organized differently from a normal control. Autism spectrum disorder seems to affect from 1 to 2 children per 1,000, and of course that has gone up to about 5. 5 children per 1,000. Why are we finding more people with autism? It's because they have added Asperger's syndrome to autism spectrum disorder. So we weren't seeing nearly as many, and now we are. We're seeing a lot more. Something else about kids with autism just like Down syndrome, the older the individual is, the more likely they will have a child with autism spectrum disorder. A lot of times what was happening in the past, if a woman had a large number of children, if she had a child with autism, it was usually the baby of the family. It was usually the youngest one. So the older she is, the more likely she's going to have a child with autism. It is far more common among male children than female children. It seems to run in families, and we do see this, children with autism. Normally it's only 1. So if you have 7 kids, it's usually, you only have 1 child that has autism. But I have seen families with a number. This is on the other reservation where I worked. There was a family with 3 children with autism. She had 5 children. She kept, the only 3 she kept were the kids with autism. The other 2 kids were, some aunt was taking care of, or the grandmother was taking care of, babies. Anyway, she had the 3 kids with autism. But 2 of them were twins, so that's kind of logical, I guess. Various areas of the brain show abnormalities among children with autism spectrum disorder, including, of course, the corpus callosum. Autism spectrum disorder, formerly called Asperger's syndrome, seems to be a less severe form of autism, where the individual does not suffer from language deficits but has problems with social interactions. And of course, that's my friend that I went to college with, who had an affair with my wife. I know. He had an affair with my wife, and the odd thing is, I don't really blame him for it, because he probably didn't even notice. I mean, potentially he came over to my house and I wasn't there. It was I was at track practice and he was on the track team. That's the bizarre part. But I wasn't there, and it just probably happened. And he didn't even think about it. He didn't think about it until afterwards, and then he felt guilty about it. So I didn't communicate with him for like 20 years after that. But finally we did communicate, and I don't know that he even remembered it. I mean, that was weird, just weird stuff. As people age, there seems to be a steady decline in brain size, and begins as early as the 30s and begins to accelerate after the age of 45. And the reality is that it all depends on how much you use your brain. You stop using your brain. This is one of the problems with retirement, and I've said this before. One of the problems with retirement is you just stop. You slow everything down. And if you do that, your brain, of course, is so used to creating new thoughts and whatnot, and if you start watching the same, well, I was talking to my friend, he watches Seinfeld. Well, geez, Seinfeld's been off the air for 10 years, and here he is watching old episodes of Seinfeld. He's only in his 30s, so I mean, it's not that big a deal. But people do that. My parents got stuck on Matlock. They started watching Matlock every afternoon. There was Matlock came on at 12 o'clock on a select channel, so they had to watch Matlock. And their brains kind of turned into tapioca, if you think about it. Not my mother, of course. My mother did crossword puzzles until the month before she died. But as far as my dad was concerned, his brain kind of turned into tapioca. The degree of decline seems to vary from individual to individual, from barely evident to exaggerated, and it really all depends on genetics. There's just a ton that has to do with genetics, and you never know if it's going to happen or if it's not going to happen to you. So what you should do is never stop learning, never slow down. if you keep active and you keep your brain active, and of course now they've got all these games that for old people. They want old people to color in coloring books. I know, adult coloring books. What's this all about? So it gets a little bizarre. Some of the things we're doing now. All these brain games that the elderly are playing, but you know, some people aren't doing anything at all, and then they just kind of die. Tom Petty just died at 66. And Hugh Hefner died at 91, and they both died of the same thing. They both died of heart failure. But one died at 66 and the other died at 91. How long, and theoretically, Hugh Hefner, he was having sex with women into his 90s. Of course, he died at 91, but, and then we have Tom Petty that died at 66. So, I mean, there's a lot of questions you can ask yourself. How long are you supposed to survive? Does rock and roll really kill you? I guess that's another question we could ask ourselves. Of course, we've got the, who are those crazy guys over in England that look like death warmed over? They keep touring, and you're going, oh, come on, Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones. Oh my God. Yet brain expansion seems to continue to occur as is evidenced by the presence of growth cones in the frontal lobe, even in the oldest individual. So if something new happens for this individual, potentially they can learn new information. They can keep accumulating new information. And they will continue to accumulate information until just before they die. Okay. One of the things, and of course, hopefully you've never seen anybody die, but if you ever are around somebody who is sick and then they decide, well, you know, I'm tired, I'm going, they have what they call terminal drop, where instead of seeing the world, they start focusing inward, and at that point they've only got a couple weeks to go before they will die, because they're focusing inward instead of seeing things on the outside. My sister died at 59 of cancer, and she was fairly lucid until about 2 weeks before she died. And at that point, everything irritated her almost all of her life. She's kind of a funny lady. But just like 2 weeks before she died, she just focused inward, and she couldn't have a conversation. She couldn't hold a conversation with people, for example. And then she, of course, died. As an individual enters their 5th decade, and of course I'm in my 7th decade, their hippocampal formation begins to shrink. The supratemporal gyrus also loses volume. In fact, most areas of the brain begin to lose volume. So theoretically, my brain is like a pea inside my skull, just kind of banging around in there, potentially. But of course, that's not true. I've stayed active. I kept my brain active. I didn't start my PhD until I was 50 years old. So, and it took me 11 years to finish my PhD. So I've been doing a little bit of thinking over the last 2 decades. Over 4 million Americans suffer from Alzheimer's disease. Oddly, the possibility of developing symptoms of Alzheimer's increases with age until about the age of 85. And if you haven't developed it by the time you're 85 years old, you'll never develop Alzheimer's. Both my mother and father didn't have Alzheimer's disease. They died of something else. My mother died at 98, my father died at 90, but neither one of them suffered from Alzheimer's disease. Neither one of them had dementia. They could remember things up until the week before they died. They could remember anything, and you could ask them any question you wanted, and they would tell you, they'd give you whatever information you were looking for. Alzheimer's disease starts as a memory loss, but progresses into greater and greater cognitive function until the individual can no longer carry on a conversation, of course. They can't remember people's faces, they don't remember their children, they can't identify their spouses, and at that stage they kind of go into a vegetative state, and then eventually, several months later, they die. And the reason they die is because the brain controls everything in the body, including your heartbeat and your breathing, and eventually they either choke to death because they can't swallow correctly, or they forget to breathe and they just die. It's a fairly painful thing to watch because these individuals can't do anything for themselves anymore. So it's really kind of a painful process. So how do you maintain them until they die? Well, you maintain them the best you possibly can. So these are individuals have to go into nursing homes, especially the last years or the last weeks or months and weeks of their lives, and then they just die. The brains of Alzheimer's patients show degeneration of axon terminals and dendrites caused by the buildup of beta amyloid forming senile plaque. And it's like the neurons in the brain become non-functional, and they just form pockets of dead tissue. Amyloid precursor protein is bound by two enzymes, beta secretase and presenilin. If one of these enzymes mutates, amyloid plaque builds up, of course, and eventually that is what takes place. In your body, of course, you're constantly replacing cells. If we get this mutation in the brain, then we start accumulating all of these dead spots in your brain, and the amyloid plaque, which is actually dead nerve cells, just builds up in your brain, and all of a sudden you're not functional. Some cells show abnormalities called neurofibrillary tangles. So the neurons, instead of, you have all this wonderful organization in your brain, and we have all these dendrites, and all of a sudden the dendrites start to curl up and are non-functional anymore, and all of a sudden we get all these tangles of neurons that are non-functional. These are tangles of the neurofilaments that are produced in abundance in the presence of the protein tau. Another gene mutation may allow Alzheimer's disease. APOE4 is supposed to break down the amyloid plaque, but is less efficient than the APOE2 or the APOE3. And of course, whether you have E3, E2, or E4 depends on genetics. And there are some individuals with E4. I have a friend whose father had early onset Alzheimer's disease. The man was brilliant. He was an engineer, and he designed transmissions for cars. This is back in the 50s and 60s. Before the 1950s, automatic transmissions were rare. Almost all transmissions were manual transmissions. And this guy came up with a way to create automatic transmissions. And he built transmissions for General Motors. So he's the one that came up with automatic transmissions, as you can imagine. But in his, by the time he was in his 50s, he was dead. And the reason he was because he had rapid onset Alzheimer's disease. Theoretically, Robin Williams was diagnosed with rapid onset Alzheimer's disease. With that type of Alzheimer's disease, normally Alzheimer's disease lasts for 4 or 5 years. Eventually you do die, of course. But rapid onset is very quick. So you develop symptoms, and 6 months later you're gone. And that's what Robin Williams theoretically had. Well, potentially my friend's father had E4. My parents obviously didn't have a problem, so they probably either had E2 or E3. Both of them lived into their 90s, and they were fairly lucid until the day they died. But my friend was afraid to have children because he was afraid he had the same problem that his father had. But he's my age. He's a year older than I am. He's 69. I'm 68. So evidently he's okay. I mean, his dad died in his 50s, but he decided not to have children. So he found a woman that agreed, well, I don't want to have children either. So, and he actually had some really strong girlfriends that he rejected because they wanted to have children, and He was afraid of his genetic structure. So he never had children. He has dogs instead. He raises little Yorkies, Yorkshire Terriers, and horses. He has dogs and horses, but he doesn't have any children. He married a woman whose father was a lawyer for General Motors. He was the chief lawyer in the area where we live. Millionaire. The guy had millions and millions of dollars. So did of course, the other guy's got millions and millions of dollars as well, because he has patents to he owns the patents to the transmissions. And these are still the transmissions being put in cars today. So both of them are fairly wealthy. Interesting people. With both amyloid plaque and neurofibrillary tangles clogging the former functional neurons of the brain, the basal forebrain nuclei die, the cells that produce acetylcholine, and the memory function of the brain dies with them. And this is a problem with Alzheimer's disease. Eventually, what produces the acetylcholine in the brain, the part that allows you to remember things, all these cells die. We do have medications now that we can we can make you as normal as you are today, because these cells are continue to die. So what we do is we give you a medication that increases the amount of acetylcholine in the synapses. Now, the acetylcholine that are in the synapses are naturally produced acetylcholine. So all we can do is increase the amount in the synapse. But as these cells die, the amount of acetylcholine available decreases. So all we can do is make you normal for right now. We can force more acetylcholine into your synapses right now. But you're going to die of Alzheimer's disease. There's just no way around it. These cells are eventually going to die, and now you've got no more acetylcholine, and now we got a problem. I've got a couple films for you. I didn't watch them all the way through, but I think they're good films. Yes.
My memory, I think, is good. I think it's good. But I mean, I know telephone numbers and my car and everything else. But sometimes it gets blurry.
My memory, I think it's pretty good. But in important things I don't seem to remember. If I could, I would be at a college.
I was in denial about how bad the Alzheimer's was, but I saw it progressing. It was getting worse. He was sleeping more and more. He was just like out of it sometimes. My dad was able to do everything, and now he's able to barely care for himself.
William and Harvey are just two of the 5.3 million people in the United States living with Alzheimer's disease, according to the Alzheimer's Association, and a new case is diagnosed every 70 seconds.
Alzheimer's disease is what we call a progressive neurodegenerative disease, and that's just a fancy way of saying that cells in the brain or neurons are dying because of the disease process.
While no one really knows what causes Alzheimer's, some of the signs include impaired memory, restlessness, language deterioration, emotional apathy, impaired behavior, and confusion.
And the family is great. We had two sons. And one was a PhD. And I can't remember the other one.
My father, he used to own a gin mill, then he went into the butcher shop business, and he also delivered beer and soda around town, and people working for him. It was an interesting life. He made it interesting, so did my mother. And they're still both around, too. Now I'm 92 years old. How about that?
Yes, memory changes lead to real functional problems.
They're still around.
People are not recognizing people that they've known for years. People are forgetting how to get to places they've gone to for years. Or people just aren't able to remember things that they used to be able to remember, to the point that it's affecting their ability to live their life, to carry out their daily tasks, that's when it's time to seek the help of a professional.
That's when Linda decided she needed some assistance.
People would come to the house and would just let them in. Strangers, perfect strangers, who would let into the house. And they would stay for hours. And I would worry that they'd be walking around my house, checking it out for later, or possibly taking things, or I didn't know if he was signing contracts for services that we didn't need.
Now Linda takes Harvey to a special day center for Alzheimer's patients, where he spends time with his new friend William and a dozen other patients. Both men are living more stimulating lives as the day center helps them to adjust to their future.
Yay. Remember I told you 14 million? And they said 5.3 million? Well, that was in 2009. This is 8 years later, of course. Wait a minute. I don't know what that is.
The human brain is a remarkable organ. Complex chemical and electrical processes take place within our brains that let us speak, move, see, remember, feel emotions, and make decisions. Inside a normal, healthy brain, billions of cells called neurons constantly communicate with one another. They receive messages from each other as electrical charges travel down the axon to the end of the neuron. The electrical charges release chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. The transmitters move across microscopic gaps or synapses between neurons. They bind to receptor sites on the dendrites of the next neuron. This cellular circuitry enables communication within the brain. Healthy neurotransmission is important for the brain to function well. Alzheimer's disease disrupts this intricate interplay. By compromising the ability of neurons to communicate with one another, the disease over time destroys memory and thinking skills. Scientific research has revealed some of the brain changes that take place in Alzheimer's disease. Abnormal structures called beta-amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles are classic biological hallmarks of the disease. Plaques form when specific proteins in the neuron's cell membrane are processed differently. Normally, an enzyme called alpha-secretase snips amyloid precursor protein, or APP, releasing a fragment. A second enzyme, gamma-secretase, also snips APP in another place. These released fragments are thought to benefit neurons. In Alzheimer's disease, the first cut is made most often by another enzyme, beta-secretase. That, combined with the cut made by gamma-secretase, results in the release of short fragments of APP called beta-amyloid. When these fragments clump together, they become toxic and interfere with the function of neurons. As more fragments are added, these oligomers increase in size and become insoluble, eventually forming beta-amyloid plaques. Neurofibrillary tangles are made when a protein called tau is modified. In normal brain cells, tau stabilizes structures critical to the cell's internal transport system. Nutrients and other cellular cargo are carried up and down the structures called microtubules to all parts of the neuron. In Alzheimer's disease, abnormal tau separates from the microtubules, causing them to fall apart. Strands of this tau combine to form tangles inside the neuron, disabling the transport system and destroying the cell. Neurons in certain brain regions disconnect from each other and eventually die, causing memory loss. As these processes continue, the brain shrinks and loses function. We now know a great deal about changes that take place in the brain with Alzheimer's disease, but there is still much to learn. What other changes are taking place in the aging brain and its cells? And what influence do other diseases, genetics, and lifestyle factors have on the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease as the brain and body age? Scientific research is helping to unravel the mystery of Alzheimer's and related brain disorders. As we learn more, researchers move ever closer to discovering ways to treat and ultimately prevent this devastating fatal disease.
Okay. That's Alzheimer's disease. And as you can see from the brain scan, this is a normal brain. And this is a brain with Alzheimer's disease. The brain not only shrinks, it not only shrinks to be smaller, but it also shrinks from the inside out. And of course, this is what happens with Parkinson's disease. This is what happens with CTE, concussion traumatic encephalopathy, concussive. Well, anyway, it has to do with football players or boxers. Their brains will hollow out, causing all kinds of interesting problems. Football players, interestingly, a lot of them commit suicide. The individuals suffering from CTE. I saw a news story the other day. They were talking about the guy that used to play for the Patriots that murdered 2 people. So they put him in jail for life, and then he killed himself, hung himself while he was in prison. He was suffering from CTE. It's not that odd, I guess. Okay, we're going to go ahead and start the next chapter. We've got about 20 minutes to go. This is chapter 8. It deals with the process of touch and pain, the sensory process of touch and pain. We're going to talk about touch first. We're going to talk about all the senses, but we're going to talk about touch first. Sensory receptor organs are present in all animal species and filter different energy information from the environment. The sensory receptors that we pay the most attention to are our sense of sight. But we are also smelling things at the same time. We're touching things. You've got your arms wrapped around you. Maybe you're a little bit cold. You can feel your hands. Potentially you can feel your gluteus maximus sitting in the chair. You've got all of this information coming in all the time. Not just touch, but eyesight, but what you're hearing, you're listening to me. You're also thinking about things, but that doesn't have anything to do with your senses. You're collecting information all the time from all of your senses. Some of the things you're going to pay attention to and some of the things you're not. Potentially right now, what I'm saying is very important to you. What you're seeing on the PowerPoint is important to you. So you're not really paying attention to how your feet feel. You're not paying attention to the smells that are coming into your nose constantly. You've always got a taste going on in your mouth. You just had a drink of water. So potentially you're tasting something in your mouth. But of course you're not paying any attention to it because there's something else that's taking is drawing your attention. You can only pay attention to one thing at a time. These sensory receptor organs respond to some stimuli but not to others, of course. Something has to be fired. Maybe you had some breakfast this morning and it was salty and there was a little piece of food in the back of your mouth and it came forward and you tasted it. But it also had sugar in it, but you're not tasting the sugar because the salt overpowered the sugar. All of these things are possibilities, and all of these things you're sensing, but at the same time you're not responding to them. Maybe you tasted the little piece of food, the salty piece of food again when it came forward, and you responded to it for a matter of microseconds. Sensory receptor organs convert environmental energy into the language of the nervous system, and these are electrical signals, of course. So all of this information is coming in constantly. This is what allows us to survive. So we are here in this classroom. There's no danger. Potentially there's no danger in here. I don't think the ceiling is about to collapse. But we're collecting information all the time. Trying to determine if we're safe, if we're not safe. Of course, all those individuals that were at the concert They thought they were safe as well. But all of a sudden, bullets started raining down from above, and they had no idea where. The biggest problem was, so all of these individuals are hitting the ground, but they're not exactly sure where the bullets are coming from. So they didn't know which way to run. Well, the only place that they could get out of the area that they were in was going toward the gunfire. And of course, nobody quite realized that. You don't think of looking up when something dangerous like that is occurring. And that's exactly what, he was up on the 32nd floor, so the bullets were actually coming at an angle down from a certain direction. They should have run away from him, but the only exit was toward him, strangely enough. So people didn't know what to do. I mean, they were sensing all of these things. They could see people bleeding. They could see people screaming and crying, and they didn't know how to react with all that sensory information coming in. They probably couldn't smell. They probably smelled blood, but they couldn't smell the gunfire because it was too far away. They couldn't smell the gunpowder anyway. So they've got all this information coming in, but they don't know how to respond to it. And potentially people don't know how to respond. I mean, unless you've been in a situation like that, you really don't know what to think. And of course, and that was part of the problem. They didn't have any place to go. There were 22,000 people there, and he was just firing round after round after round, dropping bullets into the mass of them. He didn't really need high-powered rounds. All he needed to do was shoot in that direction, and the bullet, even if it arced, it would hit somebody because there were just masses of people down there. A sensory system requires different receptors to discriminate among forms of energy. Light comes in as light. It comes in as electrical energy, and of course it's converted in our eyes to more electrical energy. We take all those little tiny pieces of information. We've got like 10 million pieces of information coming in, and we have to form a picture, and we take all those 10 million pieces of electrical energy and we form them into a picture. And this is happening every microsecond. Well, the picture is changing. I have a Fitbit. It's not working very well. I have some of the pixels are missing. So I have to watch the number. It loads from the right to the left, and of course some of my pixels are missing, so I have to watch it as it's going across to figure out what time it is. Oh, I'm sorry, it loads left to right. It's 9:30, 9:56. I think it is, that's what my watch says anyway. This thing says 9:58, okay, that's pretty close. Maybe it does say 9:58. Could say 9:58, but I have to watch it as it comes across. If you look at something really fast, it doesn't look like anything's moving. It looks like everything's stable. So as we are perceiving something, what we are getting is a snapshot, and of course that's what our brain is. We're getting this picture, and it's a single picture. A sensory system discriminates among different intensities of stimulation. A sensory system must respond in a reliable manner. A sensory system must respond rapidly. A sensory system must suppress extraneous information. So we've got a lot of different information coming in. And this was the problem in Las Vegas. They had a lot of extraneous information, but the most important information was too minuscule. So they didn't know how to respond. They couldn't figure out how they needed to respond to save themselves. Because if you think of somebody attacking you, you don't think of somebody up there attacking you. It's somebody close to you that's attacking you. And here the person was like 300 yards away. And he was the one that was attacking. So if I'm in a group of people, I'm assuming that the danger is close to me. And of course that was part of the problem. They didn't have any clue who was the bad guy and who were the good guys. They had too much extraneous information. is the shooting coming from the stage? Is the shooting coming from over here? They could hear the bullets. They could hear the bullets. They could hear the rounds, and it sounded like a machine gun. And as it turned out, it wasn't a machine gun. It wasn't an automatic weapon. He had a special stock on his gun that allowed him to shoot the gun rapidly. So it was semi-automatic. He had to pull the trigger every time, but the stock was recoiling and bouncing against his trigger finger and making him shoot very, very rapidly. It sounded like a machine gun. It's called a bump stock. I'd never heard of one before. I'm guessing they're going to outlaw them now. Just a guess. It's hard to say what's going to happen next. But if you have a magazine of 45 bullets, you can shoot those 45 rounds in about 15 or 16 seconds, and it sounds like a machine gun. And of course, you're loosing that many bullets in a matter of seconds because of this bump stock. Stimuli that sensory systems detect are either in the form of physical energy or chemical substances. Each sensory organ is designed to receive and transmit a specific type of stimuli to the brain. The receiving portion of the sensory organ is the receptor cell. The receptor cell converts the energy into an electrical potential, and of course, that electrical potential goes to the brain, and you try to detect what's going on. If you've ever been in a dangerous situation, of course, you're trying to process information very, very rapidly, and that's one of the ways that you save your life is by processing information very rapidly. When a receptor cell changes the energy of a stimulus to the readable electrical or chemical potential, it is called sensory transduction. Thus, the receptor cell is known as a transducer. Some receptor cells have axons of their own, while others stimulate an associated nerve ending. And as we go through all the sensory systems, you're going to see things like the sensory cells in your eye. Of course, they stimulate associated nerve endings. It's not a neuron. It's not a neuron itself. It stimulates something else. The structure of a receptor determines the forms of energy to which it will respond. For example, your eyesight is an electrical energy, is taking in light, so it's mechanical. Touch, of course, is a physical thing. Taste is chemical, as is your sense of smell is chemical as well. The receptor cell's generator potential is the change that must take place between the impact of the stimuli and the initiation of nerve impulses. Generator potential is presented by electrical change, and we're talking about generating. We're talking about stimulating enough stimulation to detect. The skin contains various types of receptors. There are 3 nerve endings in the epidermis that detect pain and temperature. There are Merkel discs and Meissner corpuscles just below the epidermis that detect touch. There are Pacinian corpuscles in the lowest level of the dermis that detect vibration. There are Ruffini's endings in the same area that detect stretching. Okay, so we've got all of these different structures, and they're all giving us different pieces of information. Once upon a time, I lived in Japan. Japan has a problem with earthquakes. And while I was there, we had earthquakes about every day. It's really kind of interesting because usually an earthquake is just a little bit of a tremble, not that big a deal. But we had some fairly heavy earthquakes. And the cats, we had 2 cats, and the cats would know that the earthquakes were coming. They could detect it almost right away because they felt, of course, they had their feet on the ground, and they could feel the trembling of the earth before it actually got severe. So they could feel the vibration starting, and they'd take off someplace. So we knew when the cats were bolting out the door that we were about to have an earthquake. The odd thing was, if you were standing up, of course you got shoes on, you're standing on the ground, you don't know if there's an earthquake or not. You have no idea because your body is swaying anyway to some extent. So you really can't tell whether it's an earthquake. The best way to tell if you're having an earthquake is if you're sitting in a hard chair, because the chair would start vibrating, and that would vibrate the sensors in your gluteus maximus, and that made your butt the best way to detect an earthquake. I know, it was really kind of strange. If you were sitting down, you could detect an earthquake. And the harder the chair that you were sitting on, the more likely that you would feel it. Of course, if you're looking at something like the television or whatever, or a picture on the wall would start moving, and of course you'd detect that as well. It's really kind of weird that your gluteus maximus was your earthquake detecting instrument. Basinian corpuscles are found throughout the body and skin cells and muscle fibers. They detect vibration, of course, and I was just telling you about how you detect an earthquake is with the Basinian corpuscles in your gluteus maximus. Basinian corpuscles are onion-shaped structures that surround the axons of afferent neurons. Afferent neurons are the neurons that go into your spinal column. Efferent send the message back, but afferent bring them to the spinal column. Vibrations produce an electrical potential whose level is directly proportional to the strength of the vibration. When the electrical impulse is strong enough, nerve impulses are generated. And of course, my cats were better at detecting an earthquake than I was, than my butt was, as it turned out. This stimulus occurs because the vibration deforms the corpuscles. This deformation leads the tip of the axon being mechanically stretched. Stretching the axon enlarges the pores in the membrane, allowing sodium ions to enter. When the generator potential reaches threshold amplitude, the axon produces one or more nerve impulses. So if you run your finger across the top of the table, what you get is a vibration. And of course, that is your Basinian corpuscles. There's not much going on, of course. But if we had an earthquake and you had your finger on the table and it started vibrating, you could feel it. So we're looking for vibration. Of course, we're in situations where there are vibrations all the time. Potentially there are vibrations in this room right now, not just from my voice, but also from the heating, however they heat this place. Whatever is the generator, whatever is happening as far as that is concerned, it's creating vibrations as well. So there are vibrations almost constantly. When you drove here, did you ride here? You walked, okay. Well, you don't have to worry about any of that stuff. If you got in a vehicle, if you were in a vehicle, then potentially the vibration of the car, but of course you don't notice it because you hear the motor, you assume that there's going to be some degree of vibration. I have a little bitty sports car, and when I drive to Gallup, or when I drive to Albuquerque, which happens from time to time, of course there's a lot of vibration in that tiny little car. But if I were in a larger car, or I were in a car with better shock absorbers, I wouldn't get the same vibration. But I can hear the vibration in my car. And usually I'm listening to the radio, usually I'm listening to a tape. I listen to my music. It's old music. It's songs you've never heard from dead people, of course, they're all dead. Each receptor cell encodes the stimulus so that touch impulses will not register colors and pain will not register smells. But each receptor has a range of response potentials that does not encompass the sensitivity that most sensory organs detect. Multiple nerve cells acting in a parallel manner give the individual a coded picture of the intensity of the stimulus. So you've got all this information coming in all the time, and it is giving you enough information so that you can react properly. Many receptors show progressive loss of response when stimulation is maintained, and this is known as adaptation. So the longer something happens, the more you adapt to it So your senses become less acute the longer you have the stimulation is coming in. When you first, when the movie starts, you've gone to a theater and watched, okay, you've gone to a theater and watched a movie, of course, and as soon as the lights go down, it's dark in there. But after a while, no matter what's on the screen or whether they don't put anything on the screen, eventually you can see fairly well in the theater because there is light coming in. It's just that it's darker than it was before. So your eyes have to adapt to the new level of brightness in the room. And eventually, of course, you do adapt. Many receptors show progressive loss. Okay, we already talked about that. That's known as adaptation. Tonic receptors show little adaptation. Phasic receptors show a rapid decrease in the frequency of nerve impulses. And luckily, one of the phasic receptors are your pain receptors. So your pain receptors, initially it's going to hurt a lot, and then all of a sudden, if you think about it, it's not as painful as it was before. The pain dissipates. Why does the pain dissipate? Well, it's phasic receptors, that's why. So you're not getting the same pain impulse that you were getting before, despite the fact that the injury is exactly the same as it was before, but it's not causing as much pain. Initially, it was something new, and it was firing off the phasic receptors. Phasic receptors did fire off, telling you that you were in pain, move your hand or whatever. Then all of a sudden, the pain wasn't nearly as intense as it was before. Each sensory modality has a select pathway that it takes to its sensory area of the brain. This is known as a sensory modality sensory pathway. Each sensory neuron has a type and an intensity of stimulus that will lead to its firing, and this is known as the sensory neuron's receptive field. Now, the sensory pathway is really kind of fascinating if we're dealing with pain, because pain impulses have a way of rerouting themselves. So if we block the sensory pathway, and we do this all the time, if you've ever had a headache, you probably took aspirin or ibuprofen or Tylenol to take the pain away. Well, that does work. But if you have a chronic pain, like a back pain, lower back pain, if you take aspirin or Aleve or whatever you're taking for your chronic back pain, eventually what will happen is those pills will stop working. And the reason is because they are blocking the sensory pathway. And pain has a way, if it is a chronic pain, it will reroute itself and your pain comes back. And of course, now we have to do something else to control your pain. We have to give you something else. All the things that we gave you before now aren't working anymore. So we're going to have to give you either something else, or we're going to have to give you something stronger. And this is one of the reasons why if somebody has a fever, well, fevers are different. If somebody has pain, what we'll do is we'll tell them, we'll take Tylenol for the first 8 hours, and then take ibuprofen, and then take Tylenol, and then take ibuprofen. What that does is it blocks two different things. So it confuses the pain, and instead of rerouting itself around whatever the ibuprofen is blocking, now the Tylenol will block something else. And so the pain, it's a little bit easier to control the pain by using two different chemicals that block two different things. The area of the brain where select sensory information is received is the primary sensory cortex. Humans average about 10 to 20 square feet of skin on their bodies, all depending on how big you are. If you're a tiny little thing, then probably you don't have 20 square feet. But of course, if you weigh 300 pounds and are 7 feet tall, then you have a lot of square feet of skin. Skin is made up of 3 layers. The first layer is the epidermis. That's the outer layer. It is relatively thick. Dermis is the second layer. It contains a network of nerve fibers, blood vessels, and connective tissue. And then the third is the subcutaneous tissue. The dermis has all the specialized outgrowths. They all originate from your dermis. We have hair, of course. We don't have feather, claws, hooves, or horns. And this is one of the reasons why a deer or an elk will lose their horns, because Actually, they're embedded in this area. They're not really attached to bone. They're attached to this area of their, or they originate in the dermis. The subcutaneous tissue are fat cells that act as thermal insulators and cushion the organs from mechanical shock. So if somebody has anorexia, one of the problems is that this layer is very small, becomes very small, because they don't have any fat. And if they don't have any fat, of course, they don't have any insulation. So it's very difficult for somebody with anorexia to control their body temperature. And this is a really serious problem. The problem with a burn is that they, especially if it's a 3rd-degree burn, it goes all the way down and destroys the fat cells. And since they don't have any covering, they have no way of controlling their body temperature. The skin acts as an insulator, and it's this fat, this layer of fat that actually is the best insulation. So if you have a burn that goes all the way through the dermis and the epidermis down to the subcutaneous tissue, now we got a really serious problem. We've got a serious problem because there's no way that you can control your temperature. And that's usually what, if somebody dies from burns, it's usually a 3rd-degree burn that goes all the way down to the subcutaneous tissue, and we have a difficult time keeping them stable. Because if you get too cold, you'll go into shock. And of course, once you go into shock, it's very difficult to bring you out. So it's kind of a difficult situation. When Pacinian corpuscles passes over a paper surface, the vibrations detected by the Pacinian corpuscles informs the individual of the texture of the paper. This is known as active touching. If you just put your finger down on the table, you can't tell what it feels like, but if you rub your finger on it, you can tell what the texture is. So you have to rub it. In other words, you have to activate the Pacinian corpuscles in order to tell what the texture of something is. Only vibrating stimuli of more than 200 hertz will pass through the corpuscles and stretch the nerve fiber to reach the threshold. Pacinian corpuscles tend to be fast responding and fast adapting receptors, and that's one of the reasons why you can, it will go away. So potentially if you rub your finger on it and then hold it there, you still can't tell the texture of the table. You have to be rubbing on it. And it's a fast responding and fast adapting receptor. So the sensations will go away. I mean, your brain isn't telling you, oh, this table feels like this, because you really can't tell unless you're rubbing your finger on it. But as long as you're rubbing your finger on it, you know exactly what the texture is, okay, no matter what the surface is. Meissner's corpuscles are touch sensitive and have a large receptor field. They are fairly numerous. Meissner's corpuscles respond to a change in stimuli. They fire rapidly and they adapt very quickly. They detect localized movement. They are more generalized touch receptors than Merkel's discs. If you've ever put your hand down on something and there was a bug there, or even more horrible than that, a mouse, and it moved, or you could feel its warmth, okay, that's the Meissner's corpuscles. I know, what a horrible thought. This happened to me the other day. I put my hand down on a cricket. And crickets, of course, move really fast. And the thing jumped out from underneath my hand. I was just sure I put my hand on a rat or something horrible like that. Why don't we stop right here? We'll pick this up next time. Right here at the Meissner's corpuscles. I do appreciate you coming to class today. I would have probably